This is part 5 of the Roaring Twenties, America in Transition. Now, the 20s were very transformative in America, and you're going to see a lot of changes during that decade. Like, for example, in entertainment. On November 2nd, 1920, you are going to have the first ever radio station go on the air in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, KDKA. It's 1020 on the AM dial, and actually, it's still on the air today. It's celebrating its 100th year here now in 2020, right? So you start having radio stations begin to hit the airways. In 1924, there's 600 commercial radio stations, just 4 years after the first one had gone on the air. Right? In 1926, the Radio Corporation of America, or RCA, decided to make the first ever national broadcasting company, a company that is going to have radio stations that have affiliates across the entire United States that are synchronizing programming. They're going to call it the National Broadcasting Company, NBC. Right? A lot of these stations, the stations you know now, NBC, CBS, ABC, had all initially began as radio stations. You're going to see movie theaters are going to become more and more popular. You're going to have the first speakeasies, right? The first movies with audio to them. You went to the movies, you got all kinds of things there. You'd go there, you'd see the matinee, but you'd also see a cartoon. You'd see the newsreels. That's where you'd get your news. Right, you'd see some of the entertainers or the sports figures of the day, right? Like maybe you see the highlights of Babe Ruth's latest baseball game, or Jack Dempsey. You listen to the radio to listen to one of his boxing matches, right? Entertainment's going to be absolutely transformed during this time period. You're going to have a sexual revolution during this time period, and I like to call it the real sexual revolution, right? Because it's going to be very different than it was before. You have women voting now in numbers never heard of before. You had women entering the workforce during World War I. That's going to have an effect on things, right? Many of them will return back in the home after the war, but you still have that large influx, right? Women are entering fields like doctors and lawyers, or breaking through some of those stigmas and barriers that have prevented them from doing that before. But they're also being more active in society. Some of this is brought about by Prohibition. You know, women drank before Prohibition. They just didn't go to bars. I mean, it was unseemly. If you were a woman and you were going to a bar, you were one of three things. You were either a prostitute, a dancer, or a pissed off wife. One of those three things, right? But once all the bars are shut down because of Prohibition, and you start having these secret illegal bars, these speakeasies open up because women who drank at home before now can't get alcohol at home, began drinking in the speakeasies. So you see them involved in society. You see them drinking and smoking in public. You see them showing off more skin than ever before. I mean, if you look at this picture here, that woman's got her feet on the table and she's showing ankles. It's a scandal, right? And then, of course, you have the flapper, which shows even shoulders, right? This kind of stuff was seen as just unheard of before. But women, this is a real sexual revolution because women's role in society is going to change fundamentally here in the 1920s. It's not like the 1960s revolution, which was really just about sex. You're going to see a continual evolution in that ongoing civil rights movement. As I mentioned, the civil rights movement is throughout this entire time period. It's not just the 1950s and 1960s, right? During World War I, you're going to have a large movement of African Americans from the South to the North. Right? Remember, at the end of the Civil War, 90% of African Americans lived in the South. During the war, because there was so much demand for these factories in the North, they would actually send recruiters to the South to try and to recruit African Americans to come up north and work in the factories. This led to what is known as the Great Migration, a large influx of African Americans moving into the northern cities, right? But of course, every place where Africans moved into these towns, there was the threat of violence, right? There was resistance to it. For example, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Tulsa, Oklahoma, by 1921, had been known as the Wall Street of Black America. It has a lot of business interests It has a 12% African American population until May 31st, 1921. On May 31st, 1921, as a backlash to this influx of African Americans into the city, a riot broke out. A riot that went for 3 days, from May 31st till June the 2nd. During this riot, you're going to have more than 300 African Americans killed. You're going to have over 1,000 homes destroyed, 40 city blocks laid the waste, right? And the African American population is going to go from 12% in Tulsa to 0 in those 3 days. So it's no wonder you have people like Marcus Garvey that you see here create organizations like the United Negro Improvement Association. Now, we've talked about accommodation in Booker T. Washington and agitation in W.E.B. Du Bois. This is another idea, separation. Marcus Garvey says we don't need them. We can create our own societies. We can create our own stores. We can create our own factories. We can live in America separate from white America, right? And the UNIA will try and do that. They will create factories, grocery stores. Matter of fact, Marcus Garvey will even go so far as to try and create a cruise line, right? The Titanic was owned by the White Star Line. He's going to create a cruise line or a shipping line called the Black Star Line, right? Now, unfortunately, he's going to get caught up. Well, he's going to get swindled quite a bit trying to create this cruise line, but he's going to get caught up with the federal government, and since he's a Jamaican national, he will actually be deported from the United States, right? But there'll also be one other thing in the 1920s that will attempt to address another major issue concerning African Americans, and that's lynching. Now, as we already know, lynching is a huge problem in the United States in the post-Civil War era. And this time period from the end of the Civil War into the 1920s is a heyday of lynching in the United States. In 1922, a Missouri senator named Leonida C. Dyer is going to introduce legislation that's going to try and make lynching a federal crime. Because at this point here in 1920, it is still not a federal crime to lynch someone, right? It's not against federal law. So he introduces the Dyer Anti-Lynching Bill in 1922. It defines what a lynch mob is. This is how it defines a lynch mob. It says, the phrase mob or riotous assemblage, when used in this act, shall mean an assemblage composed of 3 or more acting in concert for the purpose of depriving any person of his life without the authority of law as a punishment for or to prevent the commission of some actual or supposed public offense. In other words, it defines a lynching as assembly of 3 or more people that are going to deprive somebody of their life, their natural right to life, for some real or perceived crime. All right. Now, the penalties for this would punish the state and the municipality that allowed the lynching to happen. It would punish the people involved in it with federal prison time, and it would fine them up to $10,000 to be given to the victims of the lynching. Now, that's great. It defines a lynch mob, it does all that, but it also has to get through the Senate. And remember, you do have the Southern Democrat portion of the Senate, that component, that anti-civil rights, that pro-white supremacist group managed to start a Democratic filibuster in 1922, and in December of 1922, this bill dies. But again, like I said, we're making progress, we're making progression. This is another step along the path towards civil rights, and so it does bear mentioning, even though this one fails, it's another step along the way.